Hello world and welcome to my little studio here in Germany. I'm very excited today because we have a new feature in Unreal Engine Metasounds, which is a wavetable oscillator, specifically included in Unreal Engine 5.1 Preview 2. And this makes me very happy because I'm a big fan of wavetable synthesis, and I have been since many, many years. I've been working a lot with plugins such as Serum, Icarus, Avenger, Pigments, and so on. And I also have some presets, patches I made for Icarus 2, which I included in the factory sound bank. So I might be a little bit biased when it comes to Icarus. But today, this is the start of a new series about wavetable synthesizers and wavetable synthesis in general. And today, as the first part, I'm going to talk about basic concepts, terminology, my own definitions, and so on. I'm going to try to answer questions such as what is a wavetable synthesizer, what is wavetable oscillator, what is wavetable synthesis, what is a wavetable, when to use it, why to use it, what are the advantages, and so on. And the occasion for this is that we have a new wavetable oscillator in Unreal Engine Metasounds, which is really great. It opens a lot of doors. And wavetable synthesis in general allows you to create quite complex sounds with just a few simple waveforms. And you don't have to use many different generators such as sine, square, and saw waves, and then connect them and use many filters to come to a specific sound. Especially if you want to create moving, changing sounds. But you just use your wavetable oscillator, which switches or fades, crossfades, morphs between different waveforms. And when you combine this with some modulation options, you can get to quite complex sounds very fast and in a very simple way. It's very user-friendly as compared to other forms of synthesis, such as additive synthesis, for instance. So I'm really happy that we have this in Unreal Engine Metasounds now, and I thought it's a nice time to start a little series about wavetable synthesis, which really is my favorite kind of audio synthesis. So today, this session is specifically targeted towards total beginners. If you don't know what a waveform, wavetable oscillator, and so on is, you are right to watch this video. If you're a professional, you already know all these terms. Maybe you get bored and you might want to skip ahead to the next video, which I'm going to upload over the course of the next few days, I guess. I'm going to talk about different synthesizer plugins, Serum, Icarus, Avenger, and so on. And I'm going to compare a few synthesizer plugins. And I'm also going to talk about the new wavetable oscillator in Unreal Engine Metasounds, probably as the last few videos in this series. Today I'm going to start with terminology and definitions, basic concepts. So first of all, music generated especially by digital synthesizers is usually based on oscillators. You can have very different oscillators here in Metasounds. You see sine, triangle, square, saw, and a wave player. These four are like the basic oscillators, more or less comparable to VCOs in modular synths or in analog synths. And wave player is just playing a sample. And you also have some other generators in Metasounds, such as a noise oscillator, which just plays randomized noise, and an additive synth. I might talk about the additive synth at a later point. It's a little bit more complex, in my opinion, as compared to most other forms of synthesis, at least to generate the specific sound you might want. This is very easy with wavetable oscillators. If you have the specific waveforms already, you can just morph between them in a plugin like Serum or Icarus, and this really opens up a lot of doors for sound synthesis. So if you look at the different oscillators here in Metasounds, the sine oscillator, triangle, square, and so on, these are all giving out basic waveforms. And in my terminology, a waveform is just a single cycle wave. So a wave that gets repeated over time, and the length of it is based on the frequency that you put into the oscillator. And frequency, of course, is also the pitch of the oscillator. So the higher the frequencies, the more repetitions you have in a specific time, and the higher the pitch of your oscillation of your sound will be. And that's the same for all these oscillators here. The difference is just how the waveform specifically looks. So for an oscillator, you basically need a frequency, which tells the oscillator how often to repeat your waveform. Then you also need some kind of specific waveform, so a sine wave or triangle wave or a square wave or pulse wave or a saw wave. These are different waveforms that are just single cycle and get repeated over time at a specific frequency to generate a specific sound for a specific pitch. Next, I want to talk about wavetables. Of course, a wavetable oscillator is based on wavetables, and a wavetable, there are some different definitions for it, especially some people refer to single cycle waves already as a wavetable. Other people use it specifically for a table, so like a collection of single cycle waves. And sometimes you find it used for any collection of audio waves, audio recordings, audio snippets that can be accessed by a synthesizer. So for some people, a simple sample player is a wavetable synth. But in my terminology, I use the term waveform for a single cycle wave, the term wavetable for a table of single cycle waves, and the term wavetable oscillator for an oscillator that plays waveforms based on a wavetable with additional tools for modulating waveform selection. So you can tell the oscillator when to play which waveform of a wavetable. And you can also modulate this table lookup, so to speak. And a wave player, I will not talk a lot about wave players today, but this, in my terminology, is just a sample player, an oscillator that places a wave from a start point to an end point in a linear way. And you can put a loop in there in some wave players, but it's not based on single cycle waves. It just plays a waveform repeatedly. Of course, you can make a loop very short, so it plays a single cycle, but it's slightly different concepts because the forms of morphing between different waves usually is only possible in wavetable oscillators, not in wave players. So just to show where wavetable oscillators located in the big realm of synthesis types or oscillators, I'm just going to give some quick descriptions of other types of synthesis. There are many more types of synthesis, but I'm just going to talk a little bit of the basic synthesis types that you find. Most of them you can find in Unreal Engine Metasounds too. But Granular, I think right now there's a Granular synth for Unreal Engine, but I think nothing like that is included in Metasounds. I made a little Granular synth module for Metasounds, but this is not not like a usual granular player. It's just more like a wave player. It also uses the wave player of Metasounds, and it's just a little bit more elaborated wave player, so to speak. Maybe I'm going to extend on that and present it at some point, but not at the moment. But there are a lot of very popular granular synths out there, such as Granulizer in Ableton. I think it's called Granulizer. Let me check for a second. Granulator, it's called Granulator. Or other synths such as or some other synthesizers, synthesizer plugins such as Mangle. Yeah, I can show you for a second. There you put an audio file in, and then the Mangle plays little grains of this audio file, multiple grains. And yeah, it's especially nice for pad sounds or for like glitchy sounds, depending on how you use a wavetable synthesizer. A wavetable, a granular synthesizer, sorry. Don't want to get confusing in the first few minutes of this basic concept video. But yeah, so subtractive synthesis is basically you have a waveform. Usually it's rich in harmonics, such as a saw wave or a square wave or a triangle wave, but you can also start with a sine wave. And then you put filters on top of it, and you filter some of the harmonics out, so you arrive at the sound you want to produce. So it's a simple static waveform that gets repeated based on the frequency, and this sound given out by the oscillator is usually shaped by filters or, of course, other effects. And yeah, in my evaluation, this type of synthesis is very much limited by the use of single waveforms, and also by the selection of waveforms, but also just by the principle that it plays a single waveform at a time, and you can't morph usually between waveforms. The next additive synthesis is much more complicated, but it's basically based on sine waves. And you just generate multiple sine waves at different frequencies, usually with different amplitudes. So usually you have like a strong fundamental, and then many sine waves at higher frequencies on top, which are lowered in amplitude. And by adding up all these sine waves, you can arrive at very complex sounds. And this is really a very flexible type of synthesis, but it's also very complicated to use. There are some plugins that make it easier to use, but for instance, the additive synth in Metasounds is, in my opinion, not very easy to really use in a way that lets you generate different sounds, complex sounds, very easily. But it's really a flexible kind of synthesis. So if you want to get into it, I can recommend it because of its flexibility, but be prepared that it might be a little bit more complicated than just using a subtractive oscillator and putting some filters on top and shaping the sound of the filters by ear, so to speak. Next, Granular, I already showed you the Mangle synth for a second, and it's just basically a kind of wave player that plays multiple grains, little parts of a wave file. And you can modulate at which position the grains are played, how much randomization is going on, and yeah, some other parameters depending on the synthesizer. So it's based on a simple wave, and it usually plays the little grains from in a linear way from left to right, or sometimes you can also play it from right to left, but it's usually always linear, at least the granular synths that I've worked with. So it's a little bit limited by this linearity and also by might be limited by the memory of whatever device you're using, because nowadays this is not so important, because computers have come a long way, but some hardware devices are still a little bit limited on how much wave files you can put there, and especially how much you can use at the same time when you have parallel waves that get played and so on. Same is true for a simple wave player, such as we have in Metasounds here. It's also called wave player. It's playing a simple wave. You have a start time. You can set if it's a loop or not. If it's looping the sound, then you have a loop start. So the first time the loop is played, when you start playing the wave, it can start in the beginning, and the loop can be a little bit later in the wave file. And you can also set the loop duration. So similar as the Granular synth, this is a little bit limited by the linearity of the playing of the wave file. And of course, depending on how you use it and how many wave files you want to play at the same time or want to switch in between, might be a little bit limited by memory, depending on what kind of device you have and what kind of waves you are playing. And last but not least, wavetable synthesis. I would define it by being a modulated playing of waveforms of a specific wavetable. And this is also sometimes called table-lookup synthesis. But the big thing about it, in my opinion, is that you can modulate which waveform is played at which time, and you can put a lot of modulators such as envelopes, LFOs, and so on it, or even randomization. And by doing that, you can get extremely complex sounds by using a simple wavetable. So it's very flexible, in my opinion, and it's also very simple to use. So for many applications, it's my synthesis of choice, or my oscillator of choice by doing sound design, or when doing sound design. Yeah, that's it for the different kinds of synthesis. Now we can talk a little bit about the different kinds of waveforms. So a wavetable oscillator is based on simple waveforms such as sine, triangle, square, and saw waves. But the nice thing about wavetable oscillators is that you can have very different waveforms in one wavetable and morph between them. Here you see a synthesizer by Cableguys called Curve. This is not a real wavetable synth. This is just a wave player, but the nice thing is that you can make your own waves here, and you also see like the waveform here, but also how it is produced in with its harmonics and like an additive synth. So let's start this. Here you see the simple sine wave. Next, the triangle wave. Next, the square wave. You see, the harmonics between the square wave and the triangle wave are very similar. It's like the same harmonics, but for the square wave, the amplitudes of the harmonics are much higher as compared to the fundamental. Now we have some form of pulse wave. Here, like a 25% pulse wave. So it's basically a square wave, which is not really like symmetrical at this point. So you have a shorter or longer pulse as compared to the basic square wave. And this is how it sounds like. And you see the harmonics get difference. Here you only have odd harmonics, and here you have odd and even harmonics. If you go to a 12.5% square wave, see the sound is changed again, and so on for 6.25. Sounds like this. And last but not least, saw wave, which you can see has all the harmonics with descending amplitudes. And this, of course, is very full. It gives a very full sound with a lot of higher frequencies. And here we have like a mixture between a square wave and a saw wave. And you see the harmonics are just in between in this case. So here we have the square, saw, and here the mixture. Yeah, that's it for curve and for the basic waveforms. Now let's turn to Wavetable synthesizer. So when you have no modulation in a Wavetable synthesizer, it basically functions as a subtractive synth. Subtractive synth has a basic waveform that is playing. In most synths you can select between different waveforms. In basic analog synths you at least usually have a selection between like sine, triangle and square, sometimes noise or some pulse, and saw. Usually also have saw. And so Wavetable synthesizer uses the same basic structure, I would say. So it has an oscillator that gives out the waveform. Then it has a filter or multiple filters. Here in Icarus you have 2 parallel filters. This is very common also in one of the Wavetable synths that got used a lot years ago in electronic dance music, especially massive. You also have multiple filters, but here in Serum you have one filter here, you have another filter in the effect section, but here for the oscillator section you have one filter with a really nice selection of filter types in Serum. And yeah, depending on which oscillators you send through the filter, you can change the sound of the oscillator. So how this sounds. So you see when I open the filter, basically the higher frequencies get added. You also see it here, down here in the equalizer. When I go down, you only have the fundamental. And the higher I go with the filter, the more harmonics you get from this wave. And you see this wave is already modulated. You can switch this off for a second. So now it stays constant, and what you now have is the same sound basically that you would have if I put this single cycle waveform, if I paint it in here and put a filter on it, low pass filter like this, you would have exactly the same sound. But what makes Wavetable synthesizer special is this modulation over the sound that you have. And you see here in this nice 3D view, you can see it just scrolls through these different waveforms. And this is the same as all the waveforms you see here, 256. This is the same that you see here. So 256 waveforms from bottom to top. And depending on this LFO in this case, it scrolls through the waveforms. So you already hear the nice modulation you get. You also see it here in the equalizer that the harmonics change. They don't stay the same. Even if I keep the filter the same, the harmonics change. Yeah, and this is basically all there is to wavetable synthesis. You have some additional very interesting stuff in most of the plugins, such as additional morph. So here you can add some kind of modulation, like frequency modulation in this case, or you can add amplitude modulation, ring modulation, and can also apply some mathematical operations. Synth, for instance, or bending, mirroring, or flipping. Yeah, and by using this, of course, you can come to very complex and evolving sounds when you modulate these parameters. I have to turn this on first. Oh, let's use the sub. So now when I do this, the frequency of oscillator A is modulated by this sub oscillator that gives out a pure sine wave. You can also use the noise oscillator. Or oscillator B, yeah, this one. So what I can also demonstrate is so we don't hear oscillator B right now, but it's running because this modulated wave, this waveform is modulated. This one is not, this one stays the same, but still you only hear oscillator B playing, oscillator A playing, but oscillator B is modulating the frequency of oscillator A. So you hear a little bit that this wavetable change here, flipping through the wavetables, is now affecting the frequency modulation of oscillator A. Even though we don't hear oscillator B directly, we hear the changes in the waveform of oscillator B because oscillator A is frequency modulated by oscillator B. And yeah, this is a form of frequency oscillation, frequency modulation. There of course are some pure FM synths that just use frequency modulation between different single waveforms like sine waves and so on. But here in plugins such as Serum or Icarus, you can use frequency modulation between wavetable synthesizers, and this of course gives you a really broad range of sounds that you can make with just 2 oscillators and just a few basic waveforms. Here you see the waveform I have, even though it's changing over time, it more or less stays very similar. So I'm not morphing from a sine wave to a saw wave or something like that. This is just some slight changes in frequencies over time. Yeah, and the same principle applies to most wavetable synthesizers that you can buy as plugins, or free ones, or half free ones, such as Vital. They have like a paid option, but they also have a free option. Let's compare the sound a little bit. You see some differences in sound. Might have activated some effects somewhere. Here of course, this one is off. Let's switch this off. Now it sounds very similar. So I did the same in Icarus here. We have our wavetable here. You can also go to the editor. In Icarus you have to click up here to get the waveforms, the single cycle waveforms. And yeah, I'm just like in Serum, I'm scrolling here through the wavetable. I don't have any filters on. I'm just using a low frequency oscillator with a triangle form to scroll through the wavetable, and you already get a nice like change in harmonics, a nice morph-like effect. Same here for Vital. I again have my wavetable. Vital also has a nice Vital also has a nice wavetable editor, and you can put any wavetable in here. And Vital is now, I applied this LFO to this parameter here. That's the wavetable position, and again it's using a triangle low frequency oscillation to scan through the wavetable. Same here for Avenger. You see the sound can be a little bit different between synthesizers. Some are a little bit clearer. Yeah, but basically it's very much alike. Yeah, maybe one or two words about Avenger too. Avenger is a more complex synth. It has many different types of synthesis, and you can do a lot with it, and it's therefore not as easily accessible as Serum or Icarus in my opinion. But it's also a very nice synth. Once you get used to it, you can use a lot of stuff. But it also doesn't have a wavetable editor as far as I know. You can click on Wavetable, now you see how it plays the different frames of the wavetable. You can reduce the number of frames and so on. It has some nice options to modulate the wavetable lookup, so to speak. Here you see you have some additional envelopes, step sequencer-like options, even for the playing of the wavetable. And you have many frequency modulation, amplitude modulation, formant and excite options, and you have some sync option. And I really like it for wavetable synthesizers when they offer lots of different options that you can use in parallel. This, especially if you make complex sounds, this is a real benefit or real advantage. Here in Serum you have more options, I think, but you can only use one option at a time. So you have to decide, do you want to use frequency modulation or mirroring or bending or syncing or amplitude modulation? While here in Avenger you don't have so many options, can't really select many things here. But what you have, here you have some more, but what you have you can use in parallel. So you can make frequency modulation while doing some syncing and so on. And this is, in my opinion, really, really great and a big advantage over other synthesizers. So even though Avenger isn't as good with regard to wavetable editing, also the wavetable import, I don't like the import options. The import options are best, in my opinion, in Icarus. But I'm going to talk about that in some other video. So even though Avenger has some disadvantages with regard to the handling, import and editing of wavetables, it has some advantages with regard to the morphing options that you can use in parallel. This is really, really, really great. Yeah, let's go to the next one. Here, Pigments. You see it's the same principle. We have a wavetable. Pigments is scanning through it based on a triangle, a low frequency oscillation, and this is just click on this. Here you see the wavetable 1 position, so 1 for the first oscillator. This is modulated, you see it here with a yellow ring outside, modulated by LFO1. So same as with the other patches for the other synthesizers. I made it scan through this wavetable based on a triangle frequency oscillator, and it sounds pretty much similar. You might argue about the sound, but I think I'm not gonna include a comparison of sound in this series of videos. There are other people that have better ears than I, maybe, and more technical skills to really evaluate the sound that's coming out, measuring how much harmonic you have for a sine wave and stuff like that. I'm not really interested in that. I'm just working with what I can hear. And personally, I like the sound of Serum. I think it's very crisp, and Icarus too. I like that very much, but also Vital, Avenger sound good too, in my opinion. Pigments, it's a little bit, I don't know, I don't like the sound of Pigments. It's not as crisp as the sound of Serum, in my opinion. But as I said, I'm not going to talk much about this on the following videos. There are other videos where people try to compare the sound, but I think it's somewhat subjective. At least the important parts are subjective. So if you like a sound or not, it's completely subjective. And of course, you can measure stuff, but I don't know if that says a lot about what you want to hear and how much you like what you're hearing. So I'm not going to talk much more about sound or sound quality at this point. Yeah, another one is Falcon, or one more word about Pigments. A nice thing about Pigments is that similar to Avenger, it offers some parallel options of morphing the sound. And this is really good. You have four options here, which lets you do a lot of different sound mangling, but I think the options in Avenger are better, and these options are very limited in my opinion if you compare it to something like Serum or Icarus. You have many more options in Serum or Icarus. Here you can use 4 in parallel, but the options even there are kind of limited. You can see here around tripods. You have some options, but it's not that many, and they are all based on this one modulator. You can cross mod from Engine 2, from the second oscillator, or you use this oscillator here. But even though it's 4 parallel options, it's more limited as compared to Avenger in my opinion. But it's great that they offer these 4 types of morphing in parallel. This is really, really great. And as you have seen for the other synthesizers, usually you have 1 or 2 morphing options and not more. Here you can select some stuff here. 2 in Vital, which is not that bad. Serum you only have 1. And here in Icarus, you have a lot of options here, but only 1. And you also can use some stuff here. No, that's the wavetable here. You can do some unison, stereo, hypersound, and so on. That's very helpful too. But this is not modulatable. For modulation, you only have this parameter. And you have a lot of options. You see it. This is really great in Icarus, but as I said, you only have 1 slot for this. Of course, you have 3 oscillators, so you can do a lot of sounds with Icarus. And I use it very, very often, but talking about parallel morphing, Pigments has some advantages here. Even though the options are more limited, you can use 4 different kinds of morphing in parallel. But now on to Falcon. See, the sound of Falcon, of course, is great too. Falcon is a really, really nice synthesizer, but in my opinion, a little bit harder to handle than most of the other synths I'm talking about. And as you can see here for the Wavetable synthesizer, you have some FM option and you have phase distortion, but yeah, it's really, the morphing options are very limited. You have here some band, formant, fuzzy, pulse wave modulation, but it's just a little bit limited as compared to the other synths. But at least you can use frequency modulation in parallel with phase distortion, so that's not bad. But still, I think the options here for Falcon with regard to wavetable morphing are a little bit limited. Yeah, Curve is not a wavetable synthesizer, I just have it in this list to show some of the waveforms, but another wavetable synthesizer is here with a creative term Wavetable, the wavetable synth of Ableton, which is included in Live Studio. And yeah, it's basically a nice wavetable player. There's sometimes some kind of a tag here. I don't know, I probably put in some, might be the amplitude or something, but you see the basic timbre of the sound is very similar to the others. There's just some like amplitude, like an amplitude spike with a more or less sharp attack. Yeah, here you also have some morph option and a fold option, but as you can see, you don't have any options here. You have two in parallel, which is great, but that's it basically. So as compared to, let's say, Serum with all these options, or Icarus with all these options, it's very, very limited. You can use two in parallel, which is great, similar as Falcon, but even in Falcon you have some more options for the two modes you have. So I would say Wavetable is the most limited wavetable synth among those that I present. No editing options of wavetables, and especially very limited morphing options. But it is nice that they include two parallel morphing options, and you can select here FM, classic and modern. So this is like a pulse wave and sync. Classic, modern is like a warp that bends it to the side, and a folding. And FM is of course basic frequency modulation. So yeah, I would say a Falcon wavetable, very similar with regard to morph options. I think I would prefer Falcon a little bit because of the flexibility for the frequency modulation, but Wavetable, for the simple implementation of wavetables, and it's nice that they give two parallel morph options here. And yeah, basically I would say it's much easier to work and much faster to work with Serum. You can take your LFO here, and like that you have a matrix assignment. So when I say matrix assignment, what I mean is delete this if I want to do it here. Here is a modulation matrix, so you have modulation sources, which can be envelopes, LFOs, or chaos, oscillators, some randomization, or macros, pitch bend, MPE, input, aftertouch, or the mod wheel. And so yeah, this is different. Some modulation sources are integral to the synthesizer, others are depending on your MIDI input. So if you have a nice MPE device, such as the instrument or keyboard, something like that, you can use these very nicely. If you have a good keyboard for playing, you can use mod wheel, aftertouch, maybe fully aftertouch, note of course, velocity, and LFO 1 to 8 you can put in here. As soon as you assign something to the LFOs, you see more LFOs coming up here. This is a very nice feature in Serum. And yeah, I can demonstrate that. So as soon as you use all the 4 LFOs, you see LFO 5, then LFO 6, LFO 7, and so on. So this is really cool stuff. And it's very, you see, it's very easy and fast to use. Whereas in Wavetable, you have fixed assignments here, and this is your mod matrix. And it's nice, you can assign amp, envelope, and 2 LFOs, 2 pitch, amp, oscillator 1 warp, oscillator 1 position, oscillator 1 fold, and I thought oscillator 2 shows up as soon as I click activate it, but maybe that's just like an auxiliary oscillator, I guess. Yeah, Wavetable I'm not using much because, as you can see, it's much faster to use something like Serum or Icarus. So maybe this is just an auxiliary. Oh no, here you see it. Wavetable position. Wavetable warp. Okay, I guess it shows up when you click it. Ah, okay, you have to assign stuff, and for the second oscillator, and then it shows up on Wavetable. So yeah, you have some nice modulation options here too, but you can just drop it on the dials like in Serum, Vital or Icarus. You put it in here in the matrix, and you only have 2 LFOs, and that's it basically. So while it's not bad, you can work with it, you can do lots of complex sounds with it. It's not as sophisticated as the modulation options in a synth like Serum, Icarus, Falcon, or Avenger or Pigments. This is more basic modulation. Of course, when you're in the Ableton Live environment, you have some Max for Live devices such as LFOs that you can use to modulate other stuff or modulate the LFOs parameters that you put in here and so on. So of course in the context of the live environment, you can do more creative stuff in Wavetable as compared to what you can do in just the Wavetable interface here. And this is great, you have some MPE parameters. MPE was introduced by Live in one of the latest versions, I think Live 10, if I'm not wrong. And yeah, you have your MIDI inputs, MPE inputs, so it's not bad. It's really lots of stuff you can modulate, but only two LFOs. Yeah, but as you can see, Wavetable is a good option if you already have Live suit and you get along with Wavetable. There's no need there might be no need to buy another Wavetable synthesizer, but if you want some advanced morphing options, or especially if you want the nice advanced editing options, you can even enter like formulas here and have lots of generation options here. I don't have the formulas I used here on my new machine. I just switched to a new machine. Normally here you can load in additional user scripts. These I haven't transferred those from my old machine over, but you really have lots of options to generate wavetables in Serum. Same for Icarus and Vital. Here you see, go to editor, and you have lots of options here to generate single waveforms and process waveforms and so on. That's really nice, and it's a lot of fun to work with wavetable editing. In my opinion, wavetable editing in combination with wavetable morphing offers some really great options to arrive at complex sounds very, very fast. Yeah, and I think that's it for my basic overview of wavetable synthesis. I hope it wasn't too complicated for beginners, and I hope even if you're a professional, maybe you encountered some new wavetable synth you haven't used so far. Over the next few sessions in this series on wavetable synthesis, I'm going to talk about some of these plugins, or maybe I make a short video about all of them, or one long comparison video. I have to look into it. So I'm going to talk about the different plugins that I'm using. And then last but not least, I'm going to talk about the wavetable oscillator in Unreal Engine Metasounds and what you can do with it, how it contrasts with other wavetable oscillators that are used in synthesizer plugins, and maybe what the advantages and disadvantages of Metasounds are as compared to the other synthesizers. But in general, it's really great. You already have these basic oscillators: wave player, additive synth, noise oscillator, and now wavetable oscillator. So I hope you learned a little bit about wavetable synthesis today, if it's a new concept to you, and see you in the next session. Bye bye.